I'd rather die than be yours, Apache woman said when the cowboy cut her chains at dawn. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The morning air was crisp as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees of the secluded camp. Ayanna, an Apache woman with striking dark eyes, stood silently in the center of the small clearing. Her wrists were bound tightly by thick chains, the metal cutting into her skin with every movement. She was not afraid, nor did she shed tears. She had seen too much in her life to fear death or pain. But in this moment, her spirit burned with a fierceness that could only come from a life spent in the struggle for survival. Her gaze, full of defiance, met the cowboy who stood just a few feet away, the one who had come to claim her life or her freedom. His name was Thomas, a man of the West, hardened by years of surviving in the wilderness. He had been sent to guard her, to ensure that she remained a prisoner until her fate was decided. He had heard the stories about the Apache people, the warriors who would never bow to the white man. But as he looked at Ayanna now, standing there with her head held high, something inside him stirred. She was not like the stories he had been told. There was a quiet strength about her, something that made him feel like he was not the one in control. The chains clinked as she shifted slightly, her movements graceful despite her restraints. She was a prisoner, yes, but in her eyes, Thomas saw no fear, only fire. You know what will happen to you, don't you? Thomas said, his voice low but firm. Ayanna didn't answer immediately. She simply watched him, her dark eyes unwavering. It was clear she had no intention of giving in to the situation, no intention of begging for her life. Thomas shifted his weight, uncertain of what to say or do. He had been sent here to guard her, to make sure she didn't escape. But something about her presence, something about the way she held herself, made him question everything he thought he knew about the Apache people. I'd rather die than be yours, Ayanna said, her voice cold and sharp as ice. Her words cut through the morning silence, making Thomas flinch. It wasn't the answer he had expected. She wasn't begging for mercy, nor was she pleading for her life. Instead, she was rejecting him, rejecting the fate he had come to enforce. The air between them grew thick with tension as Thomas stared at her, searching her face for any hint of weakness. But there was nothing. Her resolve was as solid as the mountains that stretched beyond the camp. Thomas's hand instinctively went to the gun holstered at his side. He had heard the stories of the Apache warriors, their strength, their honor, and their unyielding will. But he had never seen one up close like this before. Ayanna was no warrior, no fierce fighter ready to strike at him. She was a woman, a captive, and yet she stood before him with the courage of 1,000 warriors. It made him uneasy. He had been raised to believe that the Apache were the enemy, that they were savages who needed to be controlled. But Ayanna was nothing like the stories he had been told. And in that moment, as he looked at her, a realization began to form in his mind. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a symbol of everything he had been taught to fear and hate. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to see her as an enemy. In the silence that followed her words, Thomas finally spoke, his voice softer now, though still laced with authority. You're not going to die, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. But you will stay here until your fate is decided. Ayanna's expression remained unchanged. She didn't respond to his words. Instead, she just continued to stare at him, her gaze unyielding, her spirit unbroken. Thomas, for the first time in his life, felt the weight of his own beliefs begin to crumble. In front of him stood a woman, a warrior in her own right, and he was beginning to understand that this was not a simple battle of life and death. It was a battle of wills, and Ayanna had already won. As the first rays of dawn bathed the clearing in golden light, Thomas stood silently, his thoughts tangled in confusion. The weight of Ayanna's words still hung in the air, sharp and unwavering. I'd rather die than be yours. He had expected resistance, but not this. Her defiance was more than just anger. It was a quiet, profound strength that stirred something deep within him. His role was clear, to guard her, to ensure she remained a prisoner. But in her eyes, he saw something he had never anticipated, a challenge to everything he thought he knew. He had been raised to believe that the Apache were the enemy, that they were to be controlled or wiped out. Yet, in front of him stood a woman who seemed to embody everything his upbringing had taught him to fear. She was no mere captive. She was a force in her own right. He felt a strange unease ripple through him, like the first tremors of a storm on the horizon. He couldn't understand it, but he knew he had to be cautious. Her silence was not weakness. It was a warning. As he stood there, staring at Ayanna, the chains that bound her glinted in the morning light, reminding him that her captivity was a symbol of the very system he had long been a part of. It was then that Thomas made a decision. He would not be the one to chain her spirit. He had already made mistakes in his life, plenty of them. But perhaps, for once, he could make the right choice. Slowly, he reached for the rusty, old key that hung from his belt. It had been given to him by his superiors with the sole purpose of keeping her under lock and key. But in this moment, that key seemed more like a symbol of his own enslavement. He hesitated for a second, glancing at the chains that bound her to the post. They were the same chains that had enslaved his conscience for years. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, unlocking her shackles with a quiet click. Ayanna remained still, her eyes never leaving his. Thomas took a step back, feeling the weight of her gaze settle over him. She didn't move immediately. There was no rush. She wasn't looking for gratitude. She wasn't looking for a savior. She simply wanted the freedom that had been stolen from her. And now, for the first time, Thomas realized that he wasn't her captor. He was just a man caught in the winds of history, struggling to make sense of a world he had never fully understood. As Ayanna slowly stood, the chains falling away from her wrists, she met his eyes once more. There was no anger in her gaze, just quiet recognition. She had known what was coming. In the world of the frontier, nothing was given freely. Everything came with a price, and now, it seemed, the price had come due. "You freed me," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But you haven't freed yourself." Thomas swallowed hard. What did she mean? He had done what was right, hadn't he? But even as the words left his mouth, he realized he wasn't sure anymore. "I don't expect you to understand," Ayanna continued. "But know this, you've chosen a side. You can't go back." Her words were like a sword, cutting through the fog of his confusion. In the distance, he could hear the faint sounds of movement, the thrum of life on the outskirts of the camp. It was a stark reminder that their choices, their actions, would ripple out and affect more than just the two of them. This was bigger than him, bigger than her. This was a battle for their lives, their people, their futures. And Thomas had just stepped into the heart of it. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around them, and in that moment, Thomas realized something. He wasn't the one who needed to be saved. It was the world around them that needed to change. As Ayanna walked past him, the weight of her presence was undeniable. She wasn't looking back. She wasn't asking for anything. She was simply walking forward, her path already set. Thomas watched her go, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and awe. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Whatever came next, he would face it with the knowledge that he had made a choice. Not as a cowboy, not as a soldier, but as a man. A man who could no longer ignore the truth. The truth that Ayanna had shown him. And in the silence that followed, Thomas knew he could never turn back. His journey had only just begun. The morning fog still clung to the trees as Thomas watched Ayanna disappear into the brush, her silhouette fading as she walked away from the camp. He stood frozen, the weight of her words still hanging in the air. "You freed me, but you haven't freed yourself." What did she mean by that? He had done what was right, or so he thought. Yet the moment she stepped away, everything he had believed about his role in the world seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. He had freed her, but now it seemed that freedom came at a cost he wasn't prepared for. The clinking of his spurs against the dirt beneath his boots was the only sound that accompanied him as he walked aimlessly around the clearing. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, his heart pounding in his chest. Was he a hero or a fool? The camp had been quiet since Ayanna left, and Thomas realized how much his life had changed in the span of a few minutes. In one instant, he had gone from being a guard, a man bound by duty, to someone who had made an irreversible decision. His entire life had been shaped by the choices of others, but in freeing Ayanna, he had made a choice of his own. And now, there was no going back. He didn't know how much time had passed when he heard the distant sound of hooves. His heart skipped a beat as he instinctively reached for his rifle. Were the bounty hunters coming for Ayanna? Or was it something worse? The sound grew louder, closer. A group of riders emerged from the tree line, and Thomas quickly recognized the leader. It was Marshal Voss, the same man who had given Thomas the orders to guard Ayanna in the first place. Voss's expression was unreadable as he approached, his gaze sharp as ever. "I see you've made a choice, Thomas," Voss said, his voice cold, almost mocking. Thomas tightened his grip on his rifle, not sure how to respond. The choice he had made felt like a weight, an anchor, pulling him down. But he wasn't about to let Voss see his uncertainty. "What do you want, Voss?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's not about what I want," Voss replied, his lips curling into a sneer. "It's about what you've done, and what you'll do next." Voss dismounted from his horse and walked toward Thomas, his boots crunching on the dry ground. His gaze flickered briefly to the empty camp, the place where Ayanna had been, but he didn't say anything about it. Instead, he continued, "You've broken the rules, Thomas. You've let her go, and now you have to face the consequences." Thomas's chest tightened. He had known this moment would come, but he had hoped for more time. Time to figure out what his next move would be. But it seemed like time was a luxury he no longer had. "I did what I had to do," Thomas said firmly, standing tall. "I freed her because it was the right thing." "The right thing?" Voss scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "The right thing for who, Thomas? The Apache girl? Or yourself?" Thomas took a step forward, his eyes locked with Voss's. He wasn't going to back down. "Not now. I didn't do it for myself. I did it because I could see the truth. You're not the one who decides what's right and wrong here." Voss laughed bitterly, stepping back, clearly not used to being challenged. "You think you're the hero in this story? You think you freed her from us? Well, think again, Cowboy. The Apache don't live in a world where they get to walk free. And neither do you." The words stung, but Thomas didn't flinch. He knew what Voss was trying to do. He was trying to provoke him, to make him question his actions. But it wasn't going to work. Thomas had made his choice. "You're wrong," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of certainty. "The Apache deserve freedom just like anyone else." Voss's face hardened as he turned to his men. "Get him," he ordered. Before Thomas could react, several of Voss's riders dismounted and grabbed him. But Thomas wasn't going down without a fight. He struggled, knocking one of the men off balance. The others tightened their hold, dragging him toward Voss. "You've made your choice, Thomas," Voss said, his voice cold as ice. "And now you'll pay the price." The feeling of being dragged through the dirt, of being overpowered by these men, ignited something inside Thomas. He was no longer the man who followed orders. Without question, he was a man who had chosen to do the right thing, and he would stand by that choice. He would fight to the end. As the riders pulled him towards Voss, Thomas's thoughts were not on the pain of the moment or the fear of what was to come. His thoughts were with Ayanna, the woman he had set free. He didn't know where she was or what would happen to her, but he knew one thing for certain. His life, whatever it was worth, would never be the same again. And in that moment, as Voss's men dragged him away, Thomas made a silent promise. He would find a way to make things right, even if it meant facing down the very men who had once been his allies. The morning light had barely touched the ground before the sound of hooves echoed through the clearing. Thomas, bound by Voss's men, was dragged along the dusty path, the sting of the ropes cutting into his wrists as they tightened. His mind was racing, trying to grasp the enormity of what had happened in the last few hours. Ayanna was free, yes, but at what cost? What had he done? What was the right thing? These questions gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too deep in the mess he had created. The men who surrounded him were silent, their faces grim, their hands steady on the reins of their horses. Voss rode ahead, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the way his eyes occasionally flicked over his shoulder toward Thomas, as if weighing something. They had reached the edge of the camp, where a few more riders awaited. As Thomas was pulled forward, his thoughts momentarily drifted to Ayanna. He didn't know where she was or what had happened to her since he had let her go. The weight of that uncertainty settled heavily on his chest. What if she was caught? What if the people who had hunted her before came after her again? He had set her free, but that didn't mean she was safe. "You're a fool, Thomas," Voss's voice cut through his thoughts. "You think you've done something noble, something right, but you've only made it worse for yourself. For her too." You'll see soon enough how much you've messed up. Thomas clenched his jaw, refusing to give Voss the satisfaction of seeing his frustration. I did what needed to be done, Thomas replied, his voice steady, though the uncertainty in his heart betrayed him. And I'll deal with the consequences, whatever they are. Voss let out a low laugh. Consequences? You're already facing them. You've crossed a line, Thomas, and now you're in over your head. There's no going back. The men with Voss were circling now, eyes on Thomas, some curious, some hardened by years of dealing with men who dared to defy the system. Thomas felt the weight of their gazes, but he stood tall. He wasn't going to back down. You don't know her, Thomas said quietly. You don't know what she means. Voss's expression flickered briefly before hardening again. I know enough. And what I know is that you've made yourself an enemy of the very system that keeps order here. And you'll pay the price. They had reached the clearing where the horses were being tied, and Voss gestured for Thomas to be secured to a post. His mind was still reeling from the situation, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. The rope dug into his skin as he was tethered to the post, and he forced himself to breathe through the pain. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. He looked up and saw Voss dismounting, walking toward him. The other riders had already positioned themselves around the camp, forming a tight circle. We're not done here, Thomas, Voss said, his voice low but carrying a cold edge. You think you're free, that you can just walk away from all of this? You've made your choice, but you don't get to choose the consequences. Thomas lifted his head, meeting Voss's eyes. He knew that Voss was trying to break him, trying to make him regret his actions. But Thomas wasn't going to give in. I made my choice, Thomas said firmly, and I'll live with it. If you want to kill me for it, then do it. But I won't be afraid. Voss's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. He turned away, walking toward the fire at the center of the camp. You're a fool, Thomas, he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'll give you this, you've got guts. Too bad they won't save you. As Voss spoke, one of his men approached, holding something in his hand. It was a piece of paper, a document that seemed to carry the weight of authority. Voss took it and held it up for Thomas to see. This is the price of your actions, Voss said coldly. You've made a mess of things, and now you'll pay the price. Thomas stared at the document, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a list of charges, accusations against him, charges of treason, of defying authority, of aiding the enemy. It was everything Voss had been waiting for, a way to make sure Thomas could never escape the consequences of his actions. As Voss's men continued to circle, Thomas felt the weight of the world closing in on him. He had no idea how to fix what he had done, no idea how to make things right. All he knew was that he had done what he believed was the right thing, and now he was going to have to face the consequences, whatever they might be. But as he looked around at the men who surrounded him, he knew one thing for sure. He was not done yet. The fight wasn't over. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. But he wasn't going to let Voss or anyone else decide his fate. Not yet. The night had settled in over the camp, casting long shadows that stretched across the dirt as Thomas sat, still bound to the post. The fire crackled softly, its warmth offering little comfort against the cold weight of the situation. He could feel the stares of Voss's men on him, their eyes calculating, assessing him like prey. The silence between them was oppressive, thick with unspoken tension. Voss had left to confer with his men, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts, but the silence didn't bring peace. Instead, it brought a sense of impending doom. He had never been one to back down from a fight, but this was different. He had made a choice to help Iana, and now it seemed the price for that choice was steep. He could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the soft whistle of a night bird in the distance, but it all felt distant. His mind kept returning to the moment when Iana had walked away from him, disappearing into the wilderness. Was she safe? Had she made it? Would she be able to find freedom, or had he doomed her to the same fate she had been escaping? He didn't know, but the guilt gnawed at him. Thomas shifted in his restraints, the ropes biting into his skin as he tried to find some comfort in his position. His body ached, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. He had done what he thought was right, but now he wasn't so sure. Had freeing Iana been the right choice? Or had he made a dangerous mistake? The question lingered in his mind like an echo. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching, heavy and deliberate. He looked up to see Voss walking toward him, his boots crunching against the ground. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he carried himself that told Thomas this wasn't just a casual visit. This was the beginning of something. Voss stopped a few feet away, studying him for a moment before speaking. "You're still alive, Thomas." "That's more than I expected," he said, his voice cold. But there was an edge to it, something darker than usual. Thomas didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. "You think you've made some noble gesture, don't you?" Voss continued, pacing slowly in front of him. "Freeing the Apache girl, thinking you've done something righteous. But the truth is, you've just become a pawn in a much bigger game. And now, you've put yourself and everyone around you in danger." Thomas's heart raced as Voss's words sunk in. He had known that freeing Ayanna would have consequences, but hearing it from Voss, from the man who had once been his superior, made it feel all the more real. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew one thing. He was caught in something he couldn't escape. "What's going to happen now?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet, but firm. Voss stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing. "What happens now, Thomas, is that you're going to learn exactly what it means to make a choice like yours. You've crossed the line, and now you're going to pay for it. You're not the hero in this story. You're just another fool who thought he could change the world. Well, guess what? The world doesn't change. People don't change." Thomas swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had thought he could make a difference, that freeing Ayanna was the right thing to do, but Voss's words hit hard. He had been naive, thinking that he could change things just by doing what felt right. But the world didn't work that way. And now, he was stuck in the mess he had created. "You're wrong," Thomas said, his voice steady. "Maybe I can't change the world, but I can change my own fate. And I'll be damned if I sit here and let you destroy everything I've fought for." Voss raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by Thomas's defiance. "You think you're in control of your fate now?" he asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You're nothing more than a pawn in this game, Thomas. And the only way out is through me. And trust me, that's not a road you want to go down." Voss's words were like a slap to the face, but Thomas didn't back down. He had made his choice, and now he would face the consequences, whatever they were. "I've made my choice," Thomas said again, his tone resolute. "And I'll face whatever comes next. But you can't make me regret it." Voss studied him for a long moment, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, in his eyes. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, his gaze fixed on Thomas. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer this time, though still laced with cold authority. "You think you're a hero, Thomas. But heroes don't make it out of situations like this. And neither do fools. You've already chosen your path, and now, you'll have to live with it." Thomas didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Voss's words had cut to the heart of the matter. He had chosen his path, and now it was time to walk it, whatever the cost. And as the fire crackled softly in the distance, Thomas knew one thing for certain. He was ready to face whatever came next. He had made his choice. Now, it was time to see it through. The morning after Voss's confrontation, Thomas found himself alone in the cold, silent camp. The ropes that had bound him to the post were now gone, but the weight of his decisions still clung to him like a second skin. Voss had left him in a state of uncertainty, his words echoing in Thomas's mind. "You're just another fool who thought he could change the world." But was he a fool? Or had he truly made the right choice? He didn't know. The air was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves, and for the first time, Thomas realized how vulnerable he truly was. The camp was deserted, the riders who had surrounded him now gone, and he was left to face the consequences of his actions alone. He had freed Ayanna, but now what? He had made a choice, but he had no idea where it would lead him. He could feel the sting of doubt creeping in, but he refused to give in to it. He had to believe that he had done the right thing. As the sun began to rise, its warmth barely reaching the cold ground, Thomas stood up and gathered what little belongings he had left. His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of hooves. His heart skipped a beat as he instinctively reached for his rifle, but he quickly stopped himself. He had no intention of fighting anymore, not with Voss's men, not with anyone. His fight was over. He wasn't a soldier, not anymore. His purpose now was something else entirely. The riders who approached were not Voss's men, but rather a small group of Native American warriors, their faces painted with the colors of their tribe. At first, Thomas tensed, unsure of what to expect. Were they here to finish what Voss had started? But as they came closer, he saw that they were not here to fight. They were here for something else. The leader of the group dismounted and walked toward Thomas. He was a tall man, his posture commanding, his eyes sharp and full of purpose. He spoke in a language Thomas didn't understand, but his tone was clear enough. There was no hostility in it. Thomas lowered his rifle slowly, unsure of how to respond. The leader of the group gestured toward the trees, where a small campfire flickered, and Thomas followed his gaze. The warriors seemed to be waiting for something. "I have not come to harm you." The leader finally spoke, his English broken but understandable. "We come to speak of the girl you freed." Thomas's heart raced. Ayanna? They knew about her. He couldn't hide his confusion. "What do you want with her?" he asked, his voice tight. The leader's gaze softened slightly, but there was still a fire in his eyes. "She is of our people," he said. "She has been taken from us before. You freed her, but there are others who will come for her. We must find her before they do." Thomas's stomach dropped. He had known that freeing Ayanna wouldn't come without consequences, but he hadn't realized just how dangerous her freedom was. He had set her free, but now he understood that he had made her a target. The warriors around him were tense, their hands on their weapons, but there was no aggression in their movements. It was clear they were not here to harm him, but to seek his help. "Where is she?" the leader asked, his voice calm but urgent. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. I let her go. She went into the wilderness. I couldn't keep her here." The leader seemed to understand, but his expression didn't change. "You must help us find her," he said. "If we do not, there will be more bloodshed." Thomas's mind raced. He had never asked for any of this. He had never asked to become involved in the affairs of the Apache or anyone else. But now, here he was, caught in the middle of something much larger than himself. He had freed Ayanna, but he didn't know how to find her or protect her from the dangers that lurked out there. The leader of the warriors waited for an answer, his gaze unwavering. Thomas looked around the camp, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could walk away. He could leave this all behind and return to the life he had before. But that wouldn't be right. He had already made his choice. He had chosen to help Ayanna, and now he had to see it through. "I'll help you," Thomas said, his voice steady. "But I don't know where she went. I'll do what I can." The leader nodded once, acknowledging his willingness to help. "We will find her," he said, turning to his men. "And when we do, we will make sure she is safe. You will be the one who leads us." Thomas hesitated. He wasn't sure he was the right person for the task, but he had no other choice. If he didn't help, Ayanna would be lost, and that was something he couldn't live with. "I'll lead you," Thomas said, his resolve hardening. "But we must move quickly. There's no time to waste." As the warriors gathered around him, preparing to track down Ayanna, Thomas felt a strange sense of purpose fill him. He wasn't just a man trying to survive anymore. He was someone who had made a difference, someone who had chosen a side. And now, he would have to face the consequences of that choice. As the group of warriors set out, Thomas followed, knowing that the path ahead would be dangerous, but also knowing that he had no other choice. He had made a promise to Ayanna, and he intended to keep it. The wind was picking up as Thomas followed the small group of Apache warriors through the dense brush, the ground beneath his boots soft and damp from the previous night's rain. The sun had begun its ascent, casting long shadows across the landscape. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, but the silence was deafening. Not a word had been spoken since they set off, and Thomas couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision he had made. Every step he took felt like it was pulling him deeper into a world he didn't fully understand, yet somehow couldn't walk away from. His thoughts kept drifting back to Ayanna. Where was she now? Had she found refuge? Or was she still running, trying to escape the chaos that followed her every step? He had freed her, yes, but the path they had both chosen was one fraught with danger. As they moved deeper into the forest, the leader of the warriors, who had remained silent up until now, finally spoke. "We must move quickly," he said in a low voice, his tone grave. "If we do not catch up to her soon, others will. The hunters are always close behind." Thomas nodded, his mind racing. He didn't need to ask who the hunters were. He knew all too well. They were the same people who had captured Ayanna, the ones who saw her as nothing more than a prize to be claimed, a bounty to be collected. The warriors around him moved like shadows, their steps light and purposeful. Thomas tried to match their pace, but the weight of his thoughts slowed him down. He had never been a part of something like this before. He had been a cowboy, a man who lived by the land and the rules of the frontier. But now, he was entangled in a fight that wasn't his own, one that seemed to have no end. They traveled through the forest for hours, the trees becoming thicker and the path more difficult to navigate. Thomas's legs ached, but he pushed forward, determined to find Ayanna, to make sure she was safe. The warriors showed no signs of tiring, their movements fluid and effortless as they navigated the terrain. They had been tracking these lands for years, and it showed in every step they took. Thomas could only hope that his decision to help them hadn't been a mistake. As they approached a clearing, the leader signaled for the group to stop. He motioned for Thomas to move closer, his expression unreadable. "We are close," he said. "We must be careful. The hunters will not stop until they find her." Thomas nodded, his heart racing. "What should I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The leader's eyes locked onto his. "You've made your choice, Thomas. Now you must stand by it. If you want to protect her, you must be ready for whatever comes next." The words were simple, but the weight of them hung heavy in the air. Thomas knew that he wasn't just fighting for Ayanna anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, something he couldn't even name. He had never felt more out of place than he did in this moment, standing in the heart of the Apache land, surrounded by warriors who had lived and fought for this land their entire lives. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not back down. As they continued through the woods, the sound of distant voices reached their ears. The leader signaled for the group to halt, his eyes narrowing as he listened carefully. "The hunters," he muttered. "They are close." Thomas's pulse quickened. He had heard the stories, the ones about the men who hunted down the Apache like animals, treating them as if they were nothing more than prey. But hearing those voices now, feeling the tension in the air, made the stories come to life in a way he hadn't imagined. The leader motioned for them to move quietly, and they continued through the underbrush, each step more deliberate than the last. The voices grew louder as they neared a small clearing up ahead. Thomas's heart was pounding in his chest as they neared the edge of the clearing. He could see the figures now, men on horseback, moving in the direction they were heading. The warriors behind him tensed, ready for a fight, but Thomas held up his hand. "We need to wait," he whispered. "Let them pass." The leader nodded, and the group crouched low, blending into the shadows. Thomas held his breath as the hunters passed by, unaware of their presence. As they moved further into the clearing, the leader's voice cut through the silence. "This way," he said. "We must move fast." They continued to track Ayanna, but now the urgency in the leader's voice was palpable. There was no time to waste. The hunters were not far behind, and Ayanna's freedom was slipping away with every passing minute. As they moved deeper into the forest, Thomas could only hope they would reach her in time. He had made his choice, and now he would see it through. Whatever the cost, he would not let Ayanna be taken again. The forest had become denser as the group moved further into the heart of the land, the trees thickening around them like silent sentinels. The air was still, but the tension between the warriors was palpable. Every step they took seemed to echo in the quiet of the forest, a constant reminder of the urgency that hung over them. Thomas's thoughts were consumed with the same question. Would they find Ayanna before the hunters did? The further they traveled, the more uncertain he became. He had no idea where she might be, and with every hour that passed, the possibility of her being caught seemed to grow. The warriors moved with purpose, but even their silent determination couldn't dispel the growing sense of dread that settled over him. They had already encountered the hunters once, and the fear that they might come upon them again was ever present. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, the leader of the warriors signaled for a halt. They had reached a small clearing, the kind that was perfect for making camp, but Thomas's mind was too focused on Ayanna to appreciate the moment. He glanced around, hoping for some sign that they were on the right path. The leader, a man with piercing eyes and a quiet authority, walked over to Thomas. "We're close," he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "We will find her." Thomas nodded, though his heart was heavy. The leader's confidence did little to ease the weight pressing on his chest. He had made a choice, but now it seemed as though that choice had led him down a path where there was no easy way out. As night fell, the warriors set up camp, their movements swift and practiced. The fire crackled in the center, casting long shadows on the faces of the men who sat around it. Thomas sat apart from the group, staring into the flames, his mind racing. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, sent his heart into his throat. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted, that the hunters were getting closer with every passing minute. It wasn't just his imagination. It was real. They were out there, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. The thought of Ayanna being pursued, possibly in danger, gnawed at him. He had freed her, but he had no idea how to protect her now. He glanced at the warriors around him, their faces unreadable in the flickering firelight. They had been silent for most of the day, but Thomas sensed their readiness. They were prepared for whatever came next, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger wasn't just the hunters. It was the world itself. The world that had made it so easy to capture and chain someone like Ayanna. The world that had put him in the position of having to choose between right and wrong, when the lines were never as clear as he had hoped. As the night wore on, Thomas's exhaustion began to take its toll. His mind was clouded with thoughts of Ayanna, of the life she had been forced to live, and of the choices they both had made. The firelight danced across his face, casting flickering shadows that seemed to mock him. Was he truly doing the right thing? Could he protect her, or was he just making things worse? The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts, and he looked up to see the leader of the warriors approaching him again. This time, there was no calm assurance in the man's eyes. Instead, there was a hint of urgency. "We have to move," he said, his voice firm. "They are close. The hunters know we're here." Thomas stood up immediately, his heart racing. "How far behind are they?" he asked, his voice tight. "Not far," the leader replied. "We need to leave now if we are to catch them." Without another word, the warriors stood and began to gather their belongings. The fire was quickly extinguished, and the camp became a flurry of quiet movement. Thomas could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a race against time, and every second counted. As the warriors disappeared into the trees, moving like shadows, Thomas followed close behind. The forest was darker now, the path less clear, but the warriors moved with the confidence of those who knew these lands like the back of their hands. Thomas tried to keep up, but his body ached from the long journey, and his mind was clouded with thoughts of what was at stake. They had to find Ayanna. They had to reach her before it was too late. The deeper they went into the wilderness, the more distant the world they knew felt. There was no going back now. They were committed, and Thomas could only hope that Ayanna had the strength to hold on, to survive whatever was coming. As they pushed forward, the sound of hooves broke the silence again, this time much closer. The hunters were near, and time was running out. The hooves grew louder, the sound echoing through the trees as the hunters drew near. Thomas's pulse quickened as he moved silently through the forest, his body aching with every step. He had pushed himself beyond his limits, but there was no turning back now. The warriors around him were equally focused, their eyes scanning the darkness, their movements swift and deliberate. They were closing in on Ayanna, but so were the hunters. Tom was slipping away. The leader of the warriors signaled for them to stop, his hand raised in a gesture of caution. They crouched low, listening intently as the sound of the approaching riders grew louder. Thomas held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that if they were discovered now, it would be the end. The hunters would catch them, and Ayanna would be lost again. But as the sound of hooves grew louder, Thomas felt a surge of determination. He had already made the choice to help her, and he wasn't going to back down now. He would fight to the end, whatever the cost. The leader of the warriors motioned for them to move forward, his hand pointing in the direction of the clearing ahead. Slowly, they moved as one, their movements silent as they followed the path that would lead them to the hunters. The tension in the air was thick, every step carrying the weight of what was at stake. They had to reach Ayanna before the hunters did. As they approached the clearing, Thomas could see the silhouettes of the hunters in the distance, their figures barely visible in the fading light. They were almost there. He could feel his heart racing in his chest, and for a moment, he thought he might not be able to go on. But then he thought of Ayanna, of the choice he had made to free her, and he knew there was no turning back. The leader of the warriors raised his hand, signaling for them to halt. They crouched down, hidden in the shadows, as the hunters passed by. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he watched them, his mind racing with the thought of what might happen if they were discovered. The hunters were close, but they had no idea that Thomas and the warriors were watching. They were so close now, Thomas could almost hear their breath, their words, but still, they moved past, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. Once the hunters had passed, the warriors moved swiftly, cutting across the clearing in the direction they had been heading. Thomas followed closely behind, his every instinct screaming for them to hurry. He didn't know how much longer they had before the hunters realized they had been followed, but he knew they had to act fast. The group moved through the underbrush, their pace quickening as they drew closer to the edge of the clearing. And then, through the trees, he saw her. Ayanna. She was standing in the clearing, looking over her shoulder as if she sensed their presence. She hadn't heard them coming, but she knew they were close. Thomas's heart skipped a beat as he saw her, and for a moment, he was frozen. She was alive. She was free, but the hunters were still out there. He didn't have time to think. He moved forward, stepping carefully, his every movement deliberate as he closed the distance between them. Ayanna turned, her eyes meeting his, and for the briefest of moments, everything else seemed to fade away. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said everything. She had been waiting for him, waiting for this moment. And now, they were here, together, on the edge of a new beginning. But before Thomas could take another step, a shout broke the silence. The hunters had spotted them. The fight had begun. Thomas's hand instinctively reached for his rifle, but he knew he couldn't do this alone. The warriors surged forward, their battle cries filling the air as they closed in on the hunters. The sound of gunfire rang out, and Thomas felt a jolt of fear in his chest. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for freedom. For Ayanna's freedom. For his own. And as the battle raged around him, Thomas knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. He had made his choice, and now, together with Ayanna and the warriors, he would fight to the end. The hunters were closing in, but they were not prepared for the fight that awaited them. Thomas's heart pounded as he raised his rifle, ready to stand and fight for the life they had chosen to live. He wasn't going to lose her now. They were in this together, and nothing was going to stop him from protecting her. The battle raged on, but Thomas knew, in that moment, that he had already won. They had found each other, and nothing could take that away.